Now, if you've been with us through this series, you know by now what John's purpose statement for writing this gospel. He says, near the end of the gospel, he's writing to provide his readers with enough evidence that you can believe that Christianity is really true. And he provides these different signs to provide this kind of evidence. And there are a lot of skeptical theologians in the 21st century who have said, well, yes, John's providing signs, but really the guy's in his very old age when he's writing. It's a couple of generations on after the events. So John's not really writing real stories. It could be just fictional things. John's more concerned about being a theologian and bringing a theological perspective. He's not interested in historical facts. Well, if that was the case, then John's really blown it here in the text that we're about to look at. Because he does something that he's actually done before in this gospel. He provides these signs, and we could look at these different signs and go back over them. Way back in chapter 5, Jesus healed a paralyzed man. And then in chapter 9, Jesus healed a blind man. Now, who were these guys? What were their names? We don't know. And quite frankly, even if we did know, it wouldn't make much difference anyway. But when it comes to prominent people who were known well at the time, John names names. Back in chapter 3, he names one of the leaders of the nation, the prominent teacher of Israel, Nicodemus. Now, if you're one of these skeptical readers of John's gospel there in the first century, and you're thinking, is this really true or not? What's the first thing you would do? You're going to go and check at Jerusalem. Was one of the leaders of our nation at that time Nicodemus? Because if he wasn't, and it turns out it wasn't true, John's gospel would have been discredited then. It wouldn't have been circulated. In fact, we wouldn't be reading it today. Well, John is doing the same thing here in our text today in chapter 11. Because we're going to see that this man, this sign that John is providing through Jesus' work is actually a man that was well known in the community. He was someone who was well known enough, and John names names. The name of someone Jesus raised from the dead is Lazarus. And, you know, it's one thing to say that, well, the skeptic will say, you know, maybe some of these healings, they could have been like that blind person could be faking it maybe. Although it would be a bit far-fetched to say a blind man in chapter 9 who's been faking it since he was born, because he's born blind all the way through. That'd be a little bit like, you know, but the skeptic will still have a go. You know, maybe Stevie Wonder's been faking it all these years. That's why he can play the piano so well. You know, the skeptic will still say it's possible that these things could be true, but you can't fake being dead. You know, someone's been in the morgue for 4 days, and suddenly raises up. You know, no, this is something big. And if you're skeptical, what John is doing by naming names is he's challenging his readers of the time to say, if you don't believe me, go and check it out for yourself, because I'm providing names, a name and address of someone who was well known at the time. Now, to get us into the frame of this, we need to recap the background from last time. So we read again from verse 1, John chapter 11, verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He named him Lazarus. He was from Bethany, that's where he lived, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So given a name and address. You know, in 1873, archaeologists uncovered a ancient burial grave called an ossuary, where there was an inscription on the grave. And the inscription was Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Now, we could rightly say now, is it the same Martha, Mary, and Lazarus? Could have been common names. Mind you, in that combination, that's got to be pretty rare. And how much more rare when Bethany was actually a small town. But whether it's the same Martha, Mary, and Lazarus or not, doesn't really bother us. The point is that it's reminding us again that what John is doing is grounding this story in facts that could be checked out by the people who were there at the time. See, John is writing this, as I reminded you, many years after the events. John is a much older man, so it's quite a lot of years have passed by. So what really happened back then? Could he have changed it around? You know, a few years ago they had the anniversary of the Holocaust of World War II. There's a 70th anniversary. Now you might have thought 70 years after the events, you know, who's going to even know to go by without a ripple? But it was quite an event for the people involved. Why? Well, because it was a matter of life and death, even though there weren't a whole lot of people still alive. There were still children and grandchildren and so on. One of our friends from the Frankston Church, his father survived Auschwitz by offering to be the cook and living on onions. He was 17 years old at the time. And when you have something like that with one of your loved ones, the story gets told that the father only died a few years ago. Put his testimony on a video. Hopefully we'll get to see it one day. But time and time again, when you've got something like that that's happened in your life, the story gets told and retold. You know, how much do we really remember from 70 years ago? Not much, unless it's something that is a matter of life and death. And you better believe those people in Bethany, they had someone who was raised from the dead, someone right there in their community. That would be talked about not only by them and their children and their grandchildren. So John, in writing this gospel, is telling us of something that is he's really saying, well, if you don't believe me, why don't you check it out? You see, there's another factor that makes this a matter of life and death. It was life and death for John's readers. You see, John's readers are people who are, many of them, skeptical. That's why John's trying to prove his case. And so they want to know if this is really true or not. But it was a matter of life and death for them. Why is it a matter of life and death for them? Because at the time John's writing, Christianity was under some of the most cruel persecution of the last 2,000 years under the crazed Emperor Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96 AD. And he was the first of the emperors to demand that he be worshipped as God. And if you didn't, it was the death penalty. So that was the situation for John's readers. As they're reading this gospel, it's not a small thing. It's not such a big deal, perhaps for people today to say, well, I'm a Christian. As long as it doesn't interfere with my life, I'll be a Christian. But for John's readers, they'd be asking you, well, do you think it would interfere with your life if you got eaten by lions? You know, that would be pretty interfering to your life, I would think. So what is he saying? Really, this is a matter of life and death to believe this gospel. For John's readers, it's a matter of life and death. And here's John trying to convince these guys it's all true. But if you believe this, fellas, you might be invited to the big game at the Colosseum this Saturday, Lions versus the Christians, and you're not going to be just spectating, you're playing full forward for the Christians and have a nice lunch, you know. That's the kind of situation these guys are facing just by believing what John is writing here. If I believe this, it's my life that could be on the line. So you better prove to me that this is true, John. Now, if you're one of those skeptical people, reading this gospel late in the first century, and John says some guy called Lazarus, who lived in Bethany, 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, raised from the dead, and it's one of the signs that Jesus did to prove who he was, what are you going to do? I say we take a little walk. It's only a couple of miles outside Jerusalem. We're going to go down to Bethany and ask the people there. Maybe Lazarus is still alive. After all, John's still alive as he's writing this. Or Martha or Mary could be still alive. If not, their children. If not, what about all the people at Bethany? They certainly would remember this great event. You're going to check it out and see if it was true. And you're going to check out not only those who might be agreed. What about the enemies? The Pharisees, they were there too. Now the skeptics. We're going to see later in this chapter that the Pharisees, they'll have something to say. If this didn't happen, let's talk to them. They'll be able to tell us. But in actual fact, quite the opposite happened. Even up to a couple of centuries later, the rabbis were still explaining away this event and Jesus' power to raise the dead, saying, he must have done it by necromancy. That means, the black magic and communicating with the dead, all that sort of stuff. Notice, they never denied, even in the subsequent years, they never actually denied that Jesus did this. Even the enemies didn't deny it. They just tried to explain it away, saying, well, it must have happened by black magic or something. In fact, we'll see next time, God willing, in the later verses, how the eyewitnesses go to the leaders, and all the leaders try to do is cover it up. So John names Lazarus along with his sisters. Read verse 2 with me. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Obviously, she's also reasonably well known because John's writing is saying, this is the Mary who, as though the readers will understand who he's talking about. In fact, the next chapter tells us that this must have been quite a well-to-do family, because there's this story about the perfume and the outrage that so much perfume is being used, but that kind of expensive perfume was only available to the very well-to-do. This was a well-to-do family, and as we'll see a little later on, Lazarus well known in the community. So we're finally picking up in our text today, really from verse 17. Let's read that. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. So there's no question, he's dead. He's been dead for 4 days. And he might be able to, fake it holding your breath for a few minutes, but not for 4 days. So verse 18, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. Now remember, when John uses the term Jews in this gospel, he's not referring to all the Jews, because he's a Jew himself and so are all the other people there. He's referring to the Jewish leaders. And we notice, this is the hint that Lazarus must have been someone well known in the community, because here these Jewish leaders are travelling out from Jerusalem, and the Jerusalemites, the tut-tut, highbrow leaders, have actually made the effort to walk 2 miles out to Bethany to pay their respects. Lazarus must have been someone well known and had an impact on the Jewish community at the time. To have the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem come out to Bethany to pay their respects, he must have been someone. He must have been someone special. So verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. So Martha saying, I know you can do whatever you ask God, He'll do it for you. Does that mean that Martha is anticipating He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead? It seems not. It seems that by that statement she must have meant, I know you can do whatever God will help you to do, because you've got to comfort us now, you've got to help us now. She's not thinking about Him raising the dead. Why? Well, for starters, Mary is, you'll see in the very next verses, is saying, no, yeah, well, I know you're going to raise Lazarus, but that'll happen at the end of time. That'll happen at the end of the day. She's not even thinking about Jesus raising Lazarus now. In fact, when later on in this chapter, when He does actually do it, and calls for the tomb to be opened, she says, no, it's going to stink. He's been dead. She's not even thinking about Jesus having the power to actually raise Him from the dead now that He's dead. Have a look at verse 23. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day, not now. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about something far more, something that is to do with an actual relationship with God, something that can only be found in Him, that you will be raised not only physically but spiritually. When Jesus says in verse 25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? So we've got here, on one hand, Jesus confidently talking about Himself as the resurrection. And in verse 26, whoever believes in me will never die. And yet, He's the same Lord who we're going to see actually weeps. Now hang on, what's going on here? He knows He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and yet He's upset. He's troubled. In fact, look at verse 33 with me. When Jesus saw her, that's Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He's deeply moved and troubled. In the original Greek language, there's the element in these words of that Jesus was actually angry. He's deeply troubled. He's angry. And the theologians have wrestled with this and said, what's He angry about? Is He angry at the unbelief of the people? Is He angry at Mary's unbelief? Well, I think it's more the case of, yes, Jesus knows He will raise Lazarus, but Jesus can also see a perspective on death that we can't possibly see. Jesus can see what the ravages of death do to a world that rebelled against Him. Jesus weeps over this evil of death, and it's personified in the fact that what it's done to his own friend, Lazarus dying, and also the sorrow that it's causing the others around him. Jesus sees what death has done. You see, to us, we think in terms of death as being, well, it's like taxes and death and taxes. It happens to everyone. It's normal. It's part of life, is death. Jesus doesn't see it that way. Death is not normal. Death is not what God gave when He gave us a good world. Death is an evil intruder. Death is an enemy to Jesus. An enemy that He came to defeat. And He's looking here at death as something that intruded into this beautiful garden that God gave, this beautiful world that God gave. And, he might be thinking, if Adam could have only seen what he was going to cause by taking that fruit from the tree, what death looked like. You see, Jesus, it says He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He's upset. He's angry. And as we're going to see a little later, He even weeps over death. Now we think, and we rightly have anger at what sin and death cause in this world. In fact, the skeptic says that's the reason why I don't believe in God. Because, look at why is God allowing all this evil and suffering and death and so on? Now we could go and launch into a whole justification for that, and there's all kinds of things we could say to that. 2 Peter 3:9, God is patient, holding back this judgment of dealing with this evil and death, waiting for you to come to repentance and faith. But we also can look at this deeply moved in spirit and troubled, or our own anger at evil. You might have heard this morning tragedy in South Korea where some people crushed to death at some Halloween celebration or something. We had our own version of that crushing thing in Australia. Remember the Myer stocktake sales before people, waiting to get in to get their bargain, and people get crushed, and they get angry at getting crushed. Why are you crushing me? But it's their all insatiable greed of everyone that's actually causing the crushing. Oh, I've only got this little part to play in this crushing, pushing forwards. But they're all playing a part. They think they've got a right to be angry because people are pushing me, but they're part of it. We think we've got a right to be angry at sin and evil in this world, but we're part of it. We're actually part of it. Who's the only one who really has the right to be angry and upset at sin, at death, at evil? It's God. And you see it in Jesus right here. Have a look at verse 35. It says that Jesus wept. Jesus wept. That's God crying. That's God crying at the evil that you and I have done to this world to cause it to be, oh yeah, we're only a little bit pushing forwards there, but we've all played our little part in why the world, we've taken part in the very thing that caused death to come into this world is called sin. We've all played our part in that. Now Jesus, no doubt, with his weeping and also the anger, would be at the perpetrator of death. Hebrews 2:14 says the devil holds the power of death. So these are the enemies. The devil. But death is an enemy. Sin is an enemy. Hell is an enemy. And what we've really got here at this stage of the gospel, remember the first 12 chapters, or first 11 chapters is Jesus' public ministry. The signs that he is before he heads to what? The battlefield. The defeat of the enemy. The cross. See, what we've got here is Jesus squaring off against the enemy. He's like one of those people in Ukraine looking at the devastation of their homes. They've lost family members, have been shot up and killed. They've had everything taken away, and yet the enemy is still coming for you. That's what it's like for Jesus here at this point. He's weeping. He's angry at the evil that the enemy has done. But the enemy's still coming for him. Still got to have the battle still ahead for Jesus. And so he cries, verse 35 again, Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible, but so powerful. Jesus wept over death because he not only saw his friend Lazarus as dying, having died with their loved ones, looking on and upset, but Jesus sees the cosmic sweep of death and what it's caused. So there's Jesus now having to go ahead to face this enemy. And how is he going to defeat this enemy? Death. What is the point of this gospel that it's leading up to? That he's going to defeat this death. And how can you defeat death if it's already happened? We know what it's like. We know that the loss and the feeling of losing someone we love and that separation. How can it be reversed? How can it be taken away? And the sin that causes us to all die, how can it be taken away? You know, there's a well-used analogy. I don't know where it originated, but it's worth repeating. When the American pioneers were first arrived in America and they're going with across land in their wagons with their families and so on, one of the great dangers they faced was what we would call a bushfire, prairie fires that would run so fast across the prairie that it could outrun you and your wagon and everything. And so they were really dangerous. So when the pioneers would see or hear of a prairie fire coming way in the distance, they would immediately deliberately burn an area of the grass where they were and get all of their families, their wagons and everything onto the burnt area so that when the prairie fire ripped through, it would go straight past them without touching them. They would be safe. Why? Because a prairie fire can't burn something that's already been burnt out. And so they were safe. Friends, you know that when Jesus went to the cross, he let the eternal wrath of God, death, burned out in his body on the cross. Sin was burned out in his body on the cross. Hell was burned out in his body on the cross. If you will repent and believe in him today, that fire will go straight past you. It can't touch you on the day of judgment. If you believe in Jesus today, Jesus faced the enemy. He went ahead and defeated the enemy at the cross through his own death and resurrection.